Hello everyone who has come and listened. I am Jay. Today I would like to tell you a story. Karoline Leavitt silences Whoopi Goldberg, The View's worst meltdown. Please listen. Have you ever witnessed a powerful voice crumble in real time? A figure who once commanded the room, suddenly struggling to hold on to control while millions watched? That's exactly what happened on The View. Whoopi Goldberg, a media titan who had ruled daytime television for decades, faced a guest unlike any before. Someone who didn't flinch. Someone who refused to be steamrolled. Someone who shattered the illusion that The View was untouchable. Her opponent? Karoline Leavitt. Young, fearless, and armed with something more powerful than rehearsed talking points. The truth. For years, The View had been a fortress of progressive dominance, where conservative guests were talked over, laughed at, and dismissed before they could even make their case. Whoopi had mastered the art of control, ensuring that only one side of the story was heard. But not this time. From the moment Karoline sat down, there was an energy shift. It wasn't just a debate. It was a battle for the truth. And when Whoopi took her first shot, expecting another easy victory, she was met with something she never anticipated. A silence. A hesitation. A realization. The audience wasn't laughing this time. The next few moments would become one of the most shocking live television moments in years. A moment that would explode across the internet. Leave that to you. View in crisis mode. And force America to rethink everything it thought it knew about media, power, and free speech. And in the end, the biggest question wasn't who won the debate. It was what this moment meant for the future. Did this moment expose something bigger than just one TV show? Is mainstream media finally losing its grip on the narrative? And most importantly, what side of history will you stand on? Comment below and let's have a real conversation. The studio lights blazed down, illuminating the sleek glass table where the hosts of The View sat, waiting. The audience, a sea of eager faces, leaned forward in their seats, expecting yet another routine takedown of a conservative guest. After all, this was Whoopi Goldberg's domain, a stage where she had spent years controlling the narrative, dictating the pace, and ensuring that opposing voices never gained ground. But today, something was different. Whoopi could feel it the moment Karoline Leavitt walked onto the set. There was no hesitation in her step, no nervous glances toward the cameras, no stiff, rehearsed posture like so many conservative guests before her. Guests who had come prepared to defend themselves, but not to win. Karoline sat down, crossed her legs, and met Whoopi's gaze head-on. There was no fear in her eyes. And for the first time in a long time, Whoopi Goldberg felt something unfamiliar creep in, an emotion she hadn't experienced on this stage in years. Doubt. She pushed it down, straightened her shoulders, and let a knowing smirk play on her lips. No conservative had ever won a debate on The View, and today wouldn't be any different. At least, that's what she thought. Her voice thick with condescension. The setup. A showdown begins. The cameras rolled, the opening remarks were made, and then, the first shot was fired. Whoopi leaned forward, her voice thick with condescension. You say you're against wokeness, Karoline, but do you realize that without wokeness, you wouldn't even be sitting here? You wouldn't have had these opportunities. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. The co-hosts nodded in agreement, already mentally writing the headlines that would follow. Karoline Leavitt schooled on The View. Whoopi sat back in her chair, waiting for the familiar pattern to unfold. The conservative guest scrambling to respond, stuttering through a rushed defense while she and her co-hosts piled on, talking over them until their voice became a distant echo beneath the studio's controlled chaos. But that didn't happen. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't shrink back or rush into a defensive apology. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, a small, almost amused smile touching her lips. She let the silence stretch, let the tension build. Then, with the calm precision of someone who had seen this attack coming from a mile away, she leaned into the microphone and delivered her response. So let me get this straight. Whoopi, You're saying that my success isn't mine, that everything I've worked for is just a product of wokeness? Is that what you believe? The laughter in the audience died instantly. A few people shifted in their seats, eyes flickering between Whoopi and Karoline, as if sensing a shift they didn't quite understand yet. For the first time in years, Whoopi hesitated. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The air in the studio changed. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't going the way it was supposed to. Woman. The unraveling begins. Whoopi recovered quickly, forcing a small chuckle as she leaned forward again, trying to regain control. Oh, please, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, you didn't get here alone. Movements like the ones I fought for paved the way for you. And now you're sitting here acting like you did it all by yourself. She gestured toward the audience, as if rallying them. A few claps followed, but it wasn't as strong as before. Karoline nodded, slowly, thoughtfully, like she was considering Whoopi's words. Then she spoke. I respect the fight for equality, Whoopi, but there's a difference between fighting for equal opportunity and demanding that people conform to a certain ideology. I'm not here because of wokeness. I'm here because I worked hard, I earned my place, and I refuse to let my success be dismissed as some ideological handout. The silence was deafening. Even some of the co-hosts looked uneasy now, as if they weren't sure whether to jump in or let Whoopi handle it. Because for the first time in years, Whoopi wasn't entirely in control. She felt it, the shift, the hesitation in her own audience. She needed to shut this down, fast. So she did something she had never had to do before. She went for the kill shot. The moment that changed everything. Whoopi's tone hardened, her voice growing sharp, cutting. You really believe you didn't benefit from these policies? If it weren't for the progress the woke movement made, do you think a young conservative woman like you would be sitting here today? It was a trap, designed to force Karoline into either admitting she benefited from wokeness or denying it outright and looking naive. The co-host smirked, confident that this was the moment Karoline would finally stumble. But Karoline didn't stumble. She smiled. Not out of arrogance, but with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing the truth is on your side. She let the question hang in the air, let the audience think about it. Then she delivered the response that would send shockwaves through the studio, through the internet, through the entire media landscape. Whoopi, I understand that past generations fought for equality, and I respect that. But here's the difference. Fighting for equality doesn't mean creating a system where people are judged by their gender or race rather than their ability. I believe in equal opportunity, not privilege disguised as justice. The audience sucked in a collective breath. A few heads nodded. Whoopi's face twitched, as if she wasn't sure whether to laugh or lash out. For the first time in The View's history, the audience wasn't automatically siding with Whoopi. They were thinking. And that, more than anything, was what terrified her. Because this wasn't just about The View. This was about something much bigger. Something she could no longer control. And the worst part? Karoline knew it too. The air inside The View studio was thick with expectation. Whoopi Goldberg sat in her usual chair, exuding confidence. Her arms crossed as she prepared for yet another routine dismantling of a conservative guest. The audience, conditioned by years of predictable debates, waited for the inevitable moment when the guest, this time Karoline Leavitt, would falter, stumble, or find herself overwhelmed by the panel's relentless attacks. But something felt different this time. From the moment Karoline walked in, her presence disrupted the usual dynamic. She wasn't like the others, those who had come before her, who had braced themselves for an onslaught of condescension, interruptions, and cheap jabs, only to leave flustered and defeated. Karoline sat with perfect composure, her eyes locked onto Whoopi's with a quiet confidence that unsettled the room. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't rattled. She was ready. Whoopi smirked, leaning forward slightly. All right, Karoline, let's talk about wokeness, she began, her tone dripping with condescension. "You've been very vocal about being against it, but do you realize that without wokeness, you wouldn't even be sitting here today? You wouldn't have had the opportunities you did. Women like me fought for women like you." Laughter erupted from the audience. The co-hosts, Joy Behar, Sunny Hostin, and Anna Navarro, nodded approvingly, their smirks widening as they prepared to pile onto the argument. It was a classic Whoopi move. Frame the conservative guest as ungrateful, hypocritical, and blind to the so-called benefits they had received from the very ideology they claimed to oppose. The crowd expected Karoline to do what so many before her had done: defend, explain, try to reason with a panel that had already decided she was wrong before she even spoke. But Karoline didn't defend. She didn't look flustered or unsure. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, took a measured breath, and smiled. For a brief moment, the audience wasn't laughing anymore. And then, in a voice so steady it cut through the tension like a knife, she responded. "So, let me get this straight, Whoopi," she said, her tone calm but razor sharp. "You're saying my success isn't mine? That everything I worked for is just a product of wokeness? Is that what you believe?" Silence. A beat too long passed before Whoopi responded, her smirk faltering just slightly. "Oh, please," she scoffed, shifting in her seat. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you didn't get here alone. Movements like mine paved the way for you, and now you want to act like you did it all by yourself." Some in the audience clapped, but it wasn't the resounding cheer Whoopi was used to. Karoline leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Whoopi. "I respect the fight for equality," she said, her voice unwavering, "but there's a difference between fighting for equal opportunity and forcing an ideology that demands compliance. You're not fighting for fairness anymore, Whoopi. You're fighting for control." A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Whoopi's fingers tensed against the table. She wasn't used to this. The audience was supposed to be on her side. She needed to shut Karoline down fast. She forced a small, brittle laugh and shook her head. "You conservatives love playing the victim," she said, a bite creeping into her voice. "You talk about free speech, but the minute someone challenges you, you act like you're being silenced. The truth is, people like you just don't like being held accountable." The crowd clapped louder this time, sensing Whoopi reclaiming ground. But Karoline didn't take the bait. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush to defend herself. Instead, she paused, letting Whoopi's words linger in the air, forcing the audience to sit with them for a moment, before she shattered them completely. "Accountability?" she echoed, her smile fading as she leaned forward. "Whoopi, let's be honest. This isn't about accountability. This is about power. When conservatives speak, we're called dangerous. When we question narratives, we're shut down. When we refuse to go along with the script, we're labeled as threats. But you know what's really dangerous? Creating a culture where people are afraid to speak at all." The audience wasn't clapping anymore. A few people in the front row nodded hesitantly, as if something had clicked that they hadn't considered before. Whoopi's expression darkened. She saw it. She felt it. The power was shifting. For years she had controlled the tempo, the narrative, the reactions, but now her own audience wasn't fully with her. She couldn't let this spiral out of her hands, so she went for the nuclear option. "So what? You think just because you sit here throwing out a few well-worded lines, you're going to change everything?" Whoopi snapped, her voice sharper now. Karoline didn't blink. "I don't need to change everything," she said smoothly. "I only need to do one thing: make people think for themselves." A hush fell over the room. Something had changed. Something so subtle, yet so undeniable that even the most loyal audience members of The View could feel it. And then something no one expected happened. From the back of the studio, a woman stood up. All eyes turned toward her. She was middle-aged, dressed professionally, someone who looked like she had been a loyal View viewer for years. Her voice was clear, steady, but carried the weight of something bigger than just this debate. "She's right," gasps. A few audience members turned to each other, whispering. Whoopi's eyes snapped toward the woman, her jaw tightening. Then another voice. Let her speak. More whispers. Then a ripple of nods across the audience. This wasn't just about Karoline anymore. This was about something deeper, a shift that had been building for years. And now, in this moment, it was boiling over on live television. For the first time in her career, Whoopi Goldberg wasn't just losing a debate. She was losing control of the conversation itself. The tension in the View's studio was no longer just a subtle undercurrent. It had become a force of its own, a thick, unspoken energy that everyone in the room could feel, but no one dared to acknowledge. Whoopi Goldberg's confident smirk had started to fade, replaced by something else, something harder, tighter, a mask of frustration she was struggling to keep in place. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. The script, the one Whoopi had followed for years, wasn't working this time. Karoline Leavitt had done something unthinkable. She had not only held her ground, but she had forced the View's audience, the very people who had come expecting a public execution, to stop and think. And that was dangerous. Because if the audience started questioning Whoopi's authority, even for a second, then the entire illusion of control would shatter. Whoopi knew she needed to regain command. Fast. She was already opening her mouth, ready to turn the conversation back in her favor. And then, Karoline's mic went dead. Silence falls, a technical issue or something more. For a split second, no one realized what had happened. Karoline was still speaking, her lips moving, her expression strong, unshaken. But nothing came through the speakers. The sound had been cut off. Whoopi's face didn't change right away. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something too controlled, too rehearsed, like she already knew. Joy Behar and Sunny Hostin glanced at each other, their own faces carefully neutral. The audience began shifting uncomfortably, glancing around. It took 3 full seconds for people to register the silence. Then the murmurs began. A woman in the front row leaned forward, whispering to the person next to her. A man near the back frowned, looking toward the sound booth. Even the co-hosts, usually quick to pounce, seemed momentarily unsure. This wasn't normal. Whoopi cleared her throat and forced a casual shrug, leaning back as if the situation was nothing more than an inconvenient hiccup. Looks like we're having some technical difficulties, she said smoothly. We'll get that fixed soon. She didn't look at Karoline. She didn't need to, because they both knew exactly what had just happened. But Karoline wasn't playing along. She leaned forward, her hands on the table, her eyes locked onto Whoopi's. And without missing a beat, she reached across the table and grabbed one of the co-host's microphones. Is this how free speech works here? The moment that changed everything. Gasps. A few people in the audience clapped hesitantly, as if unsure whether they were allowed to react. Karoline's voice, now stronger than before, rang through the speakers. Is this how free speech works here, Whoopi? The entire studio froze. The control room, hidden behind the cameras, was thrown into chaos. Producers were scrambling, whispers flying back and forth through headsets. Who cut the mic? Was this planned? Fix this now. But it was too late. Karoline had seized the moment, and the audience was paying attention. She didn't stop. This is exactly what I was talking about, she continued, her voice calm, but charged with something more powerful than anger. Conviction. When you can't win the argument, you shut people down. You pretend we don't exist. You cut the mic and expect the audience to just go along with it. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. For the first time, some people weren't sure who they should be clapping for. Whoopi's smirk had vanished completely. She wasn't amused anymore. She leaned forward, her eyes dark, sharp, her voice lower, more serious. Oh, come on, Karoline, she said, waving a dismissive hand. No one is silencing you. It was just a technical issue. But you conservatives love playing the victim, don't you? It was a last-ditch effort, a way to push Karoline back into a defensive position. But Karoline wasn't playing defense. She wasn't backing down. She leaned in, matching Whoopi's intensity. A technical issue? She repeated, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Her smile was slow, deliberate. What a coincidence, Whoopi. Right when I was making a point that your audience was actually listening to. A few people in the crowd nodded. And then, a woman stood up. The audience turns the breaking point. She was sitting near the back, dressed in a simple navy blue blazer. A woman who had probably been a loyal viewer of The View for years. And yet, she stood. She took a deep breath, and in a voice that carried through the hushed studio, she said, "Let her speak." A wave of murmurs spread through the room. Then, another voice. "Yeah, let her talk." A man stood up next, then another, and then, "Let her speak." The chant erupted, growing louder, stronger. Whoopi's face was frozen, her eyes darting toward the control room, searching for someone, anyone, to fix this. But no one knew what to do, because this wasn't just about The View anymore. This wasn't just another debate. This was a turning point. A moment when something bigger than Whoopi Goldberg, bigger than Karoline Leavitt, bigger than this show itself was happening. And Whoopi could feel it slipping away. The illusion was cracking. The control was fading. The power was shifting. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one dictating the conversation. And the most terrifying part? She had no idea how to get it back. The chant echoed through the studio, rising in volume, fueled by an energy no one had expected. Let her speak. Let her speak. The rhythm of those three words pulsed through the air, breaking through the once unshakable fortress of The View. Whoopi Goldberg, the unchallenged queen of daytime television, the woman who had spent decades controlling the conversation, sat frozen. This wasn't supposed to happen. The audience was supposed to cheer for her, laugh when she landed a snide remark, nod in agreement when she dismissed a conservative guest with a well-timed eye roll. But now, they weren't with her anymore. Not completely. Not the way they used to be. And that realization sent a slow, creeping chill through her veins. A moment of panic. Whoopi glanced around the set, searching for an out. Her co-hosts were tense, their smiles forced, their eyes darting between the audience and the producers scrambling behind the cameras. Joy Behar looked like she was waiting for Whoopi to fix this. Sunny Hostin sat with her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. Even the normally outspoken Ana Navarro seemed uncertain, like she wasn't sure if she should jump in or stay silent. And then there was Karoline Leavitt, sitting calmly, her hands folded neatly in front of her, watching Whoopi with quiet amusement. She wasn't angry, she wasn't flustered, she was waiting, because she knew she had already won. The audience revolt, a historic shift. The chant continued, rumbling through the studio, breaking apart the carefully curated environment Whoopi had spent years crafting. Let her speak. Let her speak. And then, something unthinkable happened. A woman in the second row, middle-aged, dressed in a professional blazer, the kind of loyal viewer Whoopi had always counted on, stood up. Whoopi's eyes snapped toward her. The woman cleared her throat, her voice steady, clear, and filled with something dangerous. Not defiance, not rebellion, conviction. I watch this show every day, she said, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. And I've never seen you cut someone's mic before. Why now? Murmurs spread through the audience. Someone in the back shouted, "Yeah, why?" A ripple of agreement moved through the room. For the first time, Whoopi wasn't the trusted voice of authority. She was the one being questioned. And she didn't like it. Her jaw tightened, her fingers curling into fists in her lap. She could feel the cameras on her, waiting for her to take back control. So she did what she had always done. She laughed. A sharp, hollow laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, come on," she said, shaking her head. "Let's not get dramatic. It was a technical issue, nothing more." But no one was buying it. Because they had heard the leaked recording. Because they had seen the truth for themselves. Because no matter how hard Whoopi tried to spin it, she couldn't rewrite what had happened live on air. And that terrified her. Karoline's final blow, the power shift. Karoline, still poised, still in complete control, lifted her microphone again. If it was just a technical issue, she said, her voice calm but cutting. Why is it that conservatives always seem to be the ones who experience these technical difficulties? Silence. A beat too long. A hesitation. And that hesitation was the breaking point. Because the audience knew. They knew. They had watched Whoopi dominate this show for years. Always in control. Always ensuring that only one narrative was heard. But this felt different. This felt exposed. And Karoline had just spoken out loud the very thing some of them had suspected for years, but had never dared to question. But this? Whoopi's breaking point, the mask cracks. Whoopi felt it slipping away. The authority. The control. The absolute certainty that she was the one leading the conversation. And the worst part? She didn't know how to stop it. Her mind raced, scrambling for an escape, a counterattack, a way to shut this down before it spiraled completely out of her hands. Then, she snapped. "Oh, please," she said, her voice sharper, colder. "Do you honestly think this audience is on your side? Do you really think they're going to pick you over me?" She let out another dry laugh. "I have spent decades fighting for people's voices to be heard. And now you're sitting here, acting like some kind of victim? Give me a break." But she had made a fatal miscalculation. Because the moment she said it, the moment she played the victimhood card herself, she had lost. Karoline's expression didn't change. She didn't even blink. Instead, she simply tilted her head and said, "Whoopi, for someone who claims to fight for free speech, you seem awfully afraid of letting people speak for themselves." Boom. The audience sucked in a collective breath. A few claps, then more. The applause grew, spreading like wildfire, until it drowned out everything else. Whoopi's face went pale. She glanced toward the producers, but there was nothing they could do. Because this wasn't just a debate anymore. This was a reckoning, and for the first time in The View's history, Whoopi Goldberg was the one on the defensive. The fallout, isn't the fallout, a moment that changed everything. The segment ended abruptly, cut to commercial far sooner than usual. Whoopi stormed off set, her hands shaking. Karoline sat back in her chair, composed, victorious, untouched. And the audience? They weren't the same anymore. Something had shifted. And Whoopi knew, deep down, in a place she didn't want to admit existed, that this wasn't just one bad day. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Something she couldn't control anymore. The moment The View cut to commercial, the tension in the studio didn't dissipate. It thickened. Whoopi Goldberg stormed off the stage, her footsteps heavy, deliberate, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. She didn't acknowledge the producers, the crew, or even her co-hosts. She just needed to get out. The cheers that had erupted for Karoline Leavitt still echoed in her ears. She had heard boos before, from critics, from political adversaries, but never from her own audience. Never had she lost them like this. Never had she felt this exposed. But as she shoved open the door to her dressing room and collapsed into her chair, she knew the real storm was still coming. Because The View might have cut to commercial. But the internet never does. The internet erupts, the viral explosion within minutes. Twitter, X, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok were on fire. #Whoopi Lost skyrocketed to the top of Twitter's trending list. Clips of Whoopi's meltdown, the mic cut scandal, and the audience revolt spread like wildfire. YouTube's algorithm pushed thousands of reaction videos to the top. Headlines exploded across social media. Whoopi Goldberg humiliated live on The View. Audience turns against her. Karoline Leavitt silences Whoopi, The View's biggest meltdown yet. Whoopi loses control. Did The View just destroy its own credibility? Twitter threads analyzed every second of the exchange. Conservative voices celebrated Karoline's composure, calling it one of the most satisfying political takedowns in television history. Liberal voices were divided. Some defended Whoopi, but many were unusually quiet. Others, more moderate, admitted that the optics looked terrible. A well-known journalist tweeted, "I don't usually agree with Karoline Leavitt, but let's be honest, The View messed up. Cutting the mic? That's a bad look for Whoopi and ABC." The responses poured in by the thousands. They cut her mic because she was winning. Period. This was Whoopi's worst moment on TV. She got exposed. "I used to love The View. Now I just see how scripted it really is." But the real earthquake came when a leaked video surfaced, and it changed everything. Smoker squirrel. The leaked footage, a scandal exposed. Late that evening, an anonymous source, allegedly a staff member from ABC, dropped a bombshell recording on Twitter. It was a backstage conversation, just minutes before the show aired. "If she starts making too much sense, cut the mic. Whoopi will handle her. If it gets bad, we'll go to commercial. We can't let her take over the conversation. This isn't her show." The internet exploded. Millions watched the clip within hours. Suddenly, this wasn't just a debate anymore. This was proof of media manipulation. Even people who didn't like Karoline couldn't ignore what had just been exposed. Fox News, Daily Wire, and independent journalists covered it relentlessly. Even CNN and MSNBC, usually defenders of The View, hesitated before addressing the controversy. They had no choice. Because now, ABC was in crisis mode. ABC's emergency meeting. The network in chaos. Inside ABC headquarters, a closed-door meeting was happening. The top executives sat around a long conference table, reports and data sprawled across it. Viewership numbers crashing, social media sentiment devastating, sponsors getting nervous. One executive rubbing his temples spoke first. "This is bad." Another nodded grimly. "Really bad." A third, flipping through a stack of papers, sighed. "Sponsors are already reconsidering their ad placements. If we don't get ahead of this, we could lose millions." Silence. Then, someone said the unthinkable. "What do we do about Whoopi?" The room stayed silent, because they all knew this wasn't just a bad moment. This could be the end of Whoopi Goldberg's reign on The View. One executive hesitated before speaking. "We could suspend her, let things cool down." Another shook his head. "Not enough. If the backlash keeps growing, we may have to." He stopped himself. No one said the word, but everyone felt it hanging in the air. Fire her. Whoopi's last stand, the fight for survival. The next morning, Whoopi sat alone in her apartment, the news blaring in the background. Her phone buzzed nonstop, texts from ABC, from publicists, from friends who either supported her or warned her to lay low. She ignored them. Instead, she scrolled through Twitter, watching clips of her own downfall. The audience chanting. The moment she lost control, the look on Karoline's face when she realized she had won. Whoopi's hands tightened into fists. She had spent decades commanding the stage, shaping the narrative, deciding what voices got to be heard. And now? Now she was the one being questioned. She had two choices. One, fight back harder. Go on another talk show, claim she was being targeted by conservative media, try to regain control of the story. 2, step back, let things cool, and hope ABC didn't pull the plug on her career. Her heart pounded, because she knew, deep down, that for the first time in her career, she wasn't the one in control anymore. The View's uncertain future, what happens next? Later that day, ABC released a carefully worded statement. "We at ABC believe in free speech and open dialogue. We are reviewing recent events to ensure our platform remains a space for meaningful conversation." It was vague. It wasn't an apology, but it was a clear sign. The View was on shaky ground. And Whoopi Goldberg? She was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the career she had spent decades building. Because if she couldn't reclaim her authority, then her time as the queen of daytime television might already be over. The moment Whoopi Goldberg stepped off the View stage, she felt it. The energy, the shift, the loss of control. For years, she had ruled that stage. Her words had dictated the conversation, her presence had commanded respect, and her audience had never questioned her authority. But today, They had turned against her. She could still hear the chants ringing in her ears. Let her speak. Let her speak. It was supposed to be her show. Yet, for the first time, she wasn't the one in control. A moment of isolation. Back in her dressing room, the lights were too bright, too harsh. The silence was too loud. She sat in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through her phone. It was worse than she expected. Whoopi Lost was still trending. Karoline's mic cut scandal was everywhere. The leaked audio had millions of views. She clenched her jaw. The comments were relentless. She got caught. No way out of this. Whoopi's done. The View will never be the same. I actually used to like Whoopi. Now, she just looks desperate. Her grip tightened around the phone, her breathing growing shallow. She had been attacked before, criticized, ridiculed, but never like this. Never had she felt this vulnerable. The ABC executives' emergency meeting. At that very moment, inside ABC's headquarters, a crisis meeting was underway. The network's top executives sat around a long conference table, their faces tense, their voices hushed. The latest reports were scattered across the table. Ratings plummeting. Public backlash exploding. Advertisers hesitating. One executive, rubbing his temples, sighed. This is a disaster. Another nodded. Sponsors are already threatening to pull out. If we don't fix this, we could lose millions. Then came the question no one wanted to ask. What do we do about Whoopi? Silence. A long, uncomfortable silence, because the truth was, no one had an answer. One executive, speaking carefully, broke the tension. We could suspend her, let the backlash cool down. Another voice countered. And if that's not enough? No one spoke. But the thought was there, hanging heavy in the air. If Whoopi couldn't fix this, then she might be done. Whoopi's last stand, the fight for survival. Back in her dressing room, Whoopi's phone buzzed. It was her agent. She hesitated before answering. Tell me something good, she muttered. The voice on the other end didn't respond immediately. Then, ABC wants a meeting. Today. Whoopi's stomach dropped. She already knew what that meant. It wasn't just a damage control meeting. It was a career survival meeting. Her pulse picked up speed, her mind racing. She had two options. Go on the offensive. Blame conservative media. Claim she was being unfairly targeted. Try to spin the narrative in her favor. 2. Step back. Admit nothing. Hope the storm passes. Neither option guaranteed survival. But the wrong move? It could end everything. A moment of reflection. The question she never expected. Whoopi set down her phone and looked back at her reflection. She had spent decades fighting for free speech, for equality, for the right to challenge authority. But today, she was the authority being challenged. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had become the very thing she once stood against. The thought unnerved her. Because if she had lost sight of that, then maybe she really had lost this battle. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and leave comments for the story.